Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sustainability in the Sea. We've got a good one for you today. We are sitting down with Andrew Lewin. He runs the podcast How to Protect the Ocean. It used to be called Speak Up for Blue, and he's been doing it for about a decade now. So he is a veteran when it comes to science communication and ocean conservation communications, and it was really just a joy to sit down with him. We talk about how we need so many of you to be creating more ocean conservation podcasts and ways that you can, turn your passion into a business and how to balance that with some of the opportunities that you might have as a marine biologist. I'm really excited about this episode specifically because it really speaks to the intergenerational collaboration that's happening with science communication and media, and I know that you'll like it too. So welcome back to Sustainability and the Sea. Welcome, Andrew Lewin, to Sustainability in the Sea.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be on this podcast. I've been listening to it for a while, and I'm just psyched to be a guest. Thank you.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, some more context about Andrew, he runs his own podcast, How to Protect the Ocean. They're so digestible and easy, and you could dive into his content for like weeks. I know I did when I first discovered it years ago, and we're going to get into all things science communication today. You're one of the science communicators that I look up to, and really just ocean conservation, your background. I feel like I don't know much about that. And yeah, let's get into it. Where are you joining us from?
I'm actually sitting in my home office in Ontario, Canada, just outside of Toronto. We are in the midst of trying to go outside and not go outside because of the smoke. Not as bad as certain areas like New York City and things like that, but it seems like it's getting better, but it all depends on where the wind shifts. So unfortunately, we're definitely feeling the direct sort of consequences of climate change right now. So yeah. It's interesting, but it's also scary as hell.
Yeah, please definitely stay safe, and all of that, the visuals that have been so staggering for folks, like it seems like that seems to happen during like the breath of wildfire season, wherever. Like I know in 2020 it happened in the west coast of the US, and it was crazy. Got to be wearing your masks and air filters and all the things.
Absolutely. It's a good thing we have our masks, right? From a global pandemic. Like it's just exactly. But you know what's interesting for us, and I know we're here to talk about the oceans, but I mean, this is kind of related. What's interesting about here in Ontario is our wildfire season is supposed to be like peaking in September, October. And if you look at the graphs and what everything's happening right now, we're actually hitting probably close to our peaks that we would normally get in September, October, and it's June. So that's the scary part is we're just starting and we haven't even hit the peak yet.
Yeah. And what's that going to look like? What's August going to look like for you all?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I mean, I always advocate for like ocean conservation is one of the biggest untapped resources to climate action and climate solutions. And so I do think that they're hopefully related, and we will get into that today. So you're a marine biologist. Could you share with our listeners a little bit about your background and maybe what you focused on? I think schooling is always really helpful for them as they're making those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. As someone who grew up in Ontario, I'm surrounded by the Great Lakes. So I was always surrounded by water, but the ocean always got me when I was a kid. I'm almost 45 today. So like back in the 80s when I was growing up, we lived off of Jacques Cousteau documentaries. Shark Week was just starting to happen. So those documentaries, like the sort of the production value kept going up higher and higher and higher every time we watched these documentaries. And I was always said to myself, I'm like, since I was the age of like 8 or 9, and then when I got to high school, I was like, I always want to do something in marine biology. Like I had the dream of like living near the water and being on a boat and doing field work and all that kind of stuff. And it's always been my passion, even to this day. Like I always love doing field work. I've been able to go to some amazing places. And so that's sort of, where I've always sat. And so during that time, it's growing up, without internet, libraries and looking at pictures, and there wasn't a lot of resources for me. So it was always frustrating a little bit. But then, going into high school, doing more, my projects and assignments always ended up being, on oceans or on ocean animals or ocean habitats or anything aquatic. I think one teacher finally like twisted my arm and said, "You got to do something on the Great Lakes." I'm like, okay. And then I discovered the Great Lakes, and I was like, this is really cool. And then you start to learn about the issues and stuff as you get to university. And I went to University of Guelph, which is local here in Ontario. We had believe it or not, we're in the middle of Ontario. We had a great marine biology program.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of professors who were like pretty high up in the Canadian science realm for oceans and phytoplankton and ichthyology and all this kind of stuff. And I learned quite a lot. And then I graduated with an undergraduate degree. I wanted to work a little bit and see where I would take. I knew I wanted to go back to do a master's in graduate work, and I was like, okay, let's see where I want to fit in here, because I had no idea where I was going at. And one of the things that I didn't like was in the program. I love the program, but one of the bad things about the program is there wasn't really much career advice.
Mm-hmm.
Even with the professors were always just like, well, here's academia. Like, this is what we know. And yeah, you can go into nonprofit work or you can go into this, but academia is where we love. And so we're going to talk about it the most, which I get. But there was nothing like dedicated, like an office of like the dean's office or anything that would kind of put you into like where you would like to go, which I would love to see more in universities. And some universities offer it and some don't. But, so I never really knew what I was going to do. And I ended up getting a job eventually about a year after I graduated. That was in like Louisiana, and it was called Louisiana University's Marine Consortium. I was basically in the Gulf of Mexico for like 8 months. I loved the work. I was a marine technician on a research vessel, got to meet a lot of other scientists, got to hear their stories, got to hear what they went through and their backgrounds. We even got to work with the Navy. It was right after 9/11 and the USS Cole incident had happened a number of years earlier. And the USS Cole was in one of the Navy bases that we were in there, and that you saw like the big hole in the battleship. So it was just like, it was really kind of surreal in terms of times were changing politically, times were changing from a military perspective, and just being able to see that and work with people from all over the world was absolutely phenomenal. I decided to go to my master's after that. I was like, okay, now I know what I want to do. Started to get into marine protected area work. After my master's, the same supervisor was like, "Hey, let's do a PhD." And I was like, "I need a break.
Yeah.
I need to go and I need to work. I don't know if I want to do a PhD." I think a lot of us, when we grow up, and I don't know if you, Chris, if you're the same, but a lot of us, when I grow up, I always thought I'm going to be a doctor. Like, I'm going to be a PhD. That's the goal. But I never really knew why. Like, you never really understand what is it needed for something? Is it not needed for something? So I decided to work a little bit. I was in Halifax when I did my master's in Nova Scotia, and then came back to Ontario got married, started a family, worked a bunch of different jobs in like a lot of freshwater and like consulting and some ocean work as well. Went to the Arctic, went to the Atlantic to do some marine mammal observing. It was so much fun. I had a great time. It was challenging to work as a marine biologist in Ontario, and just as an aquatic biologist in Ontario in general. But I started to figure out how to apply to jobs and how to start to get interviews. And I was like, okay, now I was more dedicated to finding the right job and finding what I wanted to do. And then I kind of realized like I'm a bit of an entrepreneur. And so I was like, I started, as I was like looking for different jobs, I was working for the government, and I started talking to some friends and family about, climate change started to creep into conversations, and people were asking me about it because I was the marine biologist of the group. I'm like, oh yeah, so there's this climate change thing. It's like, it's not real, right? And I'm just sitting there, wide-eyed. I'm like, are you kidding me? Because at the time, like, we were seeing, like, you got to remember where we're at. Like, I was in Ontario. We had family in New York and different places in Quebec and stuff, but we hadn't really seen a lot of effects of climate change. Even Ontario itself. I was actually just saying this in February before these fires happened. I was like, we're pretty lucky in terms of, we don't get a lot of natural disasters, really. We don't get hurricanes. It's very rare where a hurricane's going to come up in Ontario. We don't get typhoons. We weren't getting wildfires at the time that were like crazy. but we're pretty lucky here. And so back in 2008, 2009, or even earlier, people didn't really know about climate change. It wasn't on their mind. And people were like, and the Kyoto Protocol was being discussed, a few years earlier. Canada had backed out, and people were like, well, it's backed out because you can't do it economically. This is ridiculous. It's going to affect everything. And meanwhile, we're just making things worse and worse and worse. And so I was getting frustrated that people didn't know about what was happening in the ocean, the stuff that, we were seeing, marine biologists and other biologists and wildlife biologists were seeing in the environment. And we're like, how can you say this? Like, you have no clue what was going on. And I thought to myself, I'm like, if I look on the internet, I'm a huge sports nerd. I see sports when I go on the internet at the time. I see sort of the major news. So you kind of keep in touch, like going on there. And then at that time, like TMZ started to come out. And so it's like, oh, celebrity gossip. Oh, great. People really want to know that. But there weren't a lot of sort of ocean news or things on the ocean. There was deepseanews.com. There was Southern Fried Science. And we were seeing some really cool blogs that were at that time that were popping up, and they were doing really, really well for what they were. But it still wasn't getting to the masses. And so I decided, I was like, I'm going to start something because I've got to do it. It's up to me. And so I was like, let's do it. So I launched a blog in like 2011, just after the deep sea horizon oil spill, and started writing. I was like, I'm going to write an article every day. Then I realized that sucks.
That's hard.
That's so hard. And I was working a full-time job at the time. And I was like, okay, that's not going to work. And then so I started doing video. And I started my daughters were, toddlers at the time. So when they went to bed at 7:30 or 6:30 or 7:30, I would do video, and I would record, and I would edit, and I would spend most of my evenings do that. And I was trying to do it like 5 days a week. And it was so tough, like to edit video and the audio on that, and to make sure everything's fine. And you're still new at it, and you're still trying to figure it out. And YouTube at the time, like 2011, 2012 was big, but not like huge as it is today. And you're just like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this. Like, maybe I should just take a break, enjoy my time off, relax. And then somebody got me into podcasting, and he's like, you should listen to these podcasts. And I started listening, and I was like, this is cool. And I was listening to more entrepreneurial podcasts at the time. Yeah. And it was so much fun. I love all that kind of stuff, and like starting businesses and this kind of, and I started listening to it. And then I was like, are there any like marine biology podcasts out there? And there were a few, but there weren't many. I think the Naked Scientists sort of group, they had an ocean one, but they weren't publishing frequently, and they weren't publishing for a long time. And so they hadn't published in a long time at the time. And I was just like, okay, well, I think I can do this. Like, I was really enjoying it. I like the fact of like, I've always wanted to do radio. So I'm like, podcasting is a way to do it. I went out and I got a Yeti mic, the one that you may not be able to see it because it's kind of washed out, but the one that's right behind me here.
That's what I have.
I went out and bought a blue Yeti. Yeah. And that was like 2013, 2014. And I just started to contact friends that I met at, conferences and stuff. I'm like, hey, I'm going to launch this thing, a podcast. They're like, what, what's a podcast? And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, hey, I just want to try to do an interview over Skype, and, let's talk. And I was trying to figure everything out. And then it just kind of like, I didn't post for like a year. I had probably about 12 interviews or 9 interviews. I didn't post for a year because I was terrified. Nobody talked about science. And I was young. I did not know much about science, and like, as much as like, if professors listen to it and they come at you, like,
I had the same.
Same right. You just get that fear, it's like going through a defense of a graduate work, and you're going up against like this panel of experts that know way more than you do. And they're questioning you, and they're seeing how far you can go. And I was worried that people were going to come at me and just be like, you're wrong, or this and that. So I was concerned. And then I just finally said, you know what? Screw it. I'm just going to publish it. And I started publishing once a week. And I didn't get a lot of feedback. I didn't get a lot of downloads. I didn't get a lot of this, but I was getting more and more comfortable publishing because I wasn't getting anything back. I was like, this is good. If nobody notices, then this is kind of good. Maybe I'll just kind of do it. And then a conference, the International Marine Conservation Conference or Congress, came out in Newfoundland in Canada. And this was in like 2016. And I was like, hey, like somebody contacted me, the director of communications contacted me. He's like, are you coming? Like, we're in your country. Are you coming to the conference? I'll set you up with a bunch of interviews for you to do. I love your podcast. I'm like,
Amazing.
first of all, who is this guy? Like, what happened is it was Dr. Ed Hine was on, who's now the president of that section, of the Marine section. And he said to me, I'd covered a story on the podcast before of his, like one of his papers. And he caught wind of it. And he was like, he had listened to the podcast ever since then. He was a huge fan. So he set me up in this, like, it was like a suite. So it had like like, he goes, yeah, come to my hotel room. I'll set you up with all these interviews. And I'm like, I don't feel comfortable asking people to come up to a hotel room to like do an interview, just me and them. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is creep. This has got creepy written all over it. I'm like, this is weird. He goes, no, it's a suite. So it's a separate room. We'll put somebody else in there. I'm like, okay, as long as they feel comfortable, then that's fine. And then that kind of like, that conference gave me the biggest confidence to continue and the biggest motivation. I was walking by people and they were recognizing me by my voice. They're like, I know that voice. You run this podcast. I was like, yeah. I did a presentation on podcasting and why more people should podcast. It was just phenomenal. And then since then, I just had this motivation. I just kicked it up. I started doing 5 days a week. At one point, I went down to 3 days a week. And then I went to 7 days a week when I was between jobs and stuff. And now I'm back to 3 days a week, shorter episodes, for a number of different reasons, which we can discuss. But it's been 9 years to like the June 22nd will be my 9-year anniversary of actually launching the podcast. And it's been a blast. Like, you have a podcast, you kind of know what comes from it. And I don't know if I've had opportunities come to me that I would never expect. I got on a TV show because of it. I've had a relationship with our local zoo because I started a podcast for them. I've had job opportunities come at me. Like, it's just a lot of really cool things have come. I've gone to conferences for free because of it. Like,
Yeah.
it's just pretty cool, with what I do. And if I can do this for the rest of my life full time, I would do it in a second.
That's honestly amazing. And also it speaks so much to how folks that you look up to believing in your work can keep you on the track that you want. Like, you were like, oh, I don't know if this is the right way, but then you had this very clear sign that yes,
Yeah,
there's a need for this, and people are coming on my platform and asking to be on my platform so that they can reach the ocean community through their ears. And I think that is it speaks so much volumes to sometimes we doubt ourselves, even though we're on the right track.
100%. And just imagine, like, I remember my first video that I posted on YouTube when I started doing video. And I had it was when it was a celebrity. She was a talk show host and her name escapes me right now. She had caught a hammerhead shark that had just been put on the protection list, but it was not in Florida state waters, it was in federal. Anyway, it was with Mark the Shark, and he's notorious for this kind of stuff. And so I criticized her in my first video. Yeah. I was like, yeah, it's legal, but it's not cool that you did this and this and that. My first comment was this like YouTuber that I had watched before, fairly big at the time. And he was basically telling me to shut up, and I was like, and you're just kind of like, oh, and that put a damper on sort of like my video making at the time. Just the confidence just went down. And I can't even imagine like if somebody came up, if I saw a professor who was older, didn't understand podcasting or sort of digital communication, or didn't think it was necessary, and I had talked to that person first and they were just like, I don't know why you're doing this. This is ridiculous. I can't even imagine how that would have affected me or others that are trying to get into science communication or trying to, find their own path, what that would have done to their career.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just
and
insane.
that was my experience. Was when I was a graduate student, I really wanted to run the social media for the cetacean necropsy lab that I was working with. And I was like, this is so important. Like, we need to be doing this because it was response for the entire island chain. Yeah. So and then it was kind of shut down for a number of reasons related to, like, it's hard to get the messaging right and things like that. But I moved away from it for a while. And then I was like, wait, this is still an inner thought that I'm having all the time, that we need more of this and that we need these stories to be told in a way that's accessible and easy and is for the younger generation that consumes information in this format that 100%. Might not be like completely familiar to us, but that it's happening in front of our eyes. And so something that you mentioned when you were sharing your background was just that we were taught that the PhD in academia route was truly the only option. And I
Hmm.
felt that way for a long time too. And I think now I was part of a master's program that had an applied option. So you didn't
Right.
have to do thesis, which is great that those are
Yep.
emerging. Um, but I'm also hoping that in coming years, and maybe it's already happened and I've just been out of school for a while, but that there are science communication disciplines that are formalized institutionally for folks to explore all of the different realms of science communication. Because I truly believe that it's going to be, and I know you agree, like a catalyst for so much action that we need in the next handful of years or decade.
I completely agree. 100%. Actually, this year, I had it in my mind to start looking for like a PhD in science communication
You're
because
going back.
well, I don't know. I've got a lot of commitment. I got daughters who are getting ready to go to university and things like that. So it's definitely a commitment.
Yeah.
Um, but I started to look and I was like, are there, because I've got this podcast that I've been running for 9 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I have this specific idea of what I want. When I look at when it's now called How to Protect the Ocean, but it was called Speak Up for Blue. But when I first started, I said, people were asking like, why are you doing this? And I'm like, if I can change the mind, not even change the mind, if I can change the behavior of one person who's listening, right? Even if I only get one person that's listening, but they start understanding what's happening with the ocean and how they affect the ocean and how they can change and how they can change their thought process, I've done my job. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's my legacy. If I can just change the behavior of one person, then I've done my job. And so for me, I've always looked at this podcast as like, I've got all this data that I don't even know about. You know what I mean? And I could turn this into a PhD to say, hey, look, like if you dedicate your time to doing this, and there are a lot of people who do podcasts, which is fantastic, which I love, and we'll talk about that in a second. But like I've had 9 years, and
Of
it's
data.
like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, of data that I could just kind of go back and be like, who's been with me for these 9 years? Who's been with me, just for a couple of months? Who's been with me for 5 years? And I want to talk to you. I want to survey you. I want to see where we're going with this and where I could take this and how we can benefit from this,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that was what my thought process was. And there's a great program that I looked into in New Zealand, and I think it's the University of New Zealand. Gina Savoy she is a professor there. She's got a background in filmmaking, but there's a group of people there that are doing sort of science communication and like wildlife communication and trying to see how you can use science communication as a way to sort of change behaviors. And so if anybody who's listening to this, ever looking to do a PhD or graduate work in any kind of way, I don't know what they offer. I was actually supposed to talk to Gina short, but she was away. And so, yeah, I think that's something that people should start looking. Even local universities, I've looked
Mm-hmm.
locally, and there's science communication programs, but they're not completely defined yet. They're not like on
Mm-hmm.
their own. They're more of like an interdisciplinary program or something like that. But I feel like there is a huge need for that. And to be honest, it's why I dedicated the past 9 years to doing this. Is I see the value in it. I see
Mm-hmm.
because I've been talking to my audience. The bad thing about podcasting, it's a one to many sort of directional, sort of messaging, right? I speak, people listen. And I like it to a certain point, but I don't like it because I want to hear back from the audience. So luckily with social media, like Instagram is probably like my favorite to get in touch with. I just say, instead of email, because people don't use email anymore. And
Right.
I'm like, I go, just DM me on Instagram. If you listen to an episode and you feel inspired or you have a question, or maybe I said something wrong or whatever, let me know. Like, I want to hear from you. And through that and just visiting like different places, I've met people who are like, I went back to graduate school because of your podcast. One guy was like a plumber in Australia, and he quit plumbing and started an organization that does beach cleanups in Australia and got funding and got all this stuff. And he has no background in science, no background in marine biology. He just said, I listened to the podcast and I was like, holy cow, I did some more research. He's like, plastic pollution is a huge problem. And I live along like near beaches in Australia, and we need to do something about it. And he started that. So it's like, you start to talk to the people and you're just like, this is where it's at. Like, this is my legacy. This is
Yeah.
what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like we need more people to do that.
Yeah. I know I always say I hope we have 1,000 ocean conservation influencers and hundreds of podcast shows talking about the ocean in like 10 years, because that's what the ocean needs. Is it needs people talking about it in their
Absolutely.
everyday lives, in casual settings. It needs it not staying within echo chambers, and it needs to just kind of become like a pervasive social norm that is welcomed.
Absolutely.
And I feel like you're contributing to that in so many valuable ways.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, and I think to add on to that too is like I mentioned before, and you mentioned it too, there are a lot more podcasts. People are starting it. It's easier to start. So it makes the technology is not as hard to get, and it's not as hard to like get a hosting site, put it up, and a lot of it's free, and you can be really economical with it. And you can just sit down and you can podcast from anywhere. You know, I mean, you live in Hawaii, if you have the equipment, you can go on the beach and just do a podcast from there. I mean, you don't want sand in your equipment, but you technically could, you know, I mean, I could do it on the Great Lakes, and I've done it on a boat before. You know, I've done interviews from my office where a person was in Antarctica, like on James and the James base or whatever it was. And you can do podcasting from anywhere. So it's easier to start. And we need to encourage more people, a diverse amount of people, and provide that, whether it's mentorship or just guidance on how to use the technology easily and quickly so that people can get their message out there as much as they can. Because, like, let's be honest, I'm a middle-aged white guy. I will resonate with certain people, and then other people I may not connect with, whether I want to or not, you know. And so we need people from all backgrounds, from all over the world, to be able to start these podcasts or radio shows or whatever you want to call them, and get that message out there.
Yeah, you know? I believe that, like, because what you're saying with it resonating is everyone has their own community of listeners, whatever, however small or big they are. And so many folks doubt themselves and doubt that they should be the one spreading the message, and they should be the one that is talking about this specific niche, just because they're like, oh, no one wants to hear that, or whatever million excuses or write-offs that kind of keep themselves small. But in reality, like, we need a ton of plastic pollution focused podcasts, or some focused on academia, or some focused specifically on science communication, and not just podcasts too, all the other ways that people consume media. And so I think that if you guys are listening and you've wanted to start an ocean conservation podcast, this is us telling you to do it.
Absolutely. And to be honest, that was my every year for Oceans Day. For some reason, one of my podcasts has never released on Oceans Day, or it's been a while. But I always do one. I always do a special one. And this year I did one all on, we need more people in podcasting, like to talk about the oceans. That was the focus. And I did the same. I was like, if you need to talk to me, I will talk to you. You know, if you want to do a group coaching call, I'll do a group coach. Like we need more people to get out there and to talk. And I remember at that conference, that first conference where I presented on podcasting, a good friend of mine said to me, she's in the audience. She said, when I was presenting, one of the questions was like, you're professing that everybody should start a podcast, but aren't you worried that, you know, about the competition? And I think, you know, is a valid question. And I think a lot of people in science are worried about the competition. People are worried about, what if you publish on my data before I do? And what about this? And what about that? And you know, trying to get ahead. And I'm all about collaboration. And I think, you know, not only do we need more people talking about podcasts, but we need more podcasters talking to each other, you know, to open those lines of communication, to be like, how can we help each other? Maybe we should just talk like once a quarter and just be like, what are your frustrations? What are your successes? How can we build, how can we do collaborations to help each other out? Should we start doing workshops at conferences and things like that to get more people involved, to be like, we've been through it. We've been through the fears. We've been through the happy times. We've been through, like, you know, podcasting at midnight, and all of a sudden you lose all your files and you're like crying on your desk because you have to do another podcast. And we've been there, and it's I want everybody to share that, so that we all feel comfortable as a podcasting community. And then we get better, right? And then we get more people talking about it. that's how I feel we should be going. And I hope that it goes that way one day.
Yeah, that mindset, we call it competition over collaboration mindset, me and my partner, is
Right.
also very pervasive in the nonprofit sector, which is my
Yes.
primary background, as well as academia, because it's like, are they going to publish on the data first? Or I
Yeah.
think ultimately the source of it comes from funding sources and grant funding, because when you're ultimately put in a inevitable competition for funding with the organization or entity that is most closest related to you in your niche. And
Yeah.
so it can prevent you from feeling like you want to show all your cards, when in reality that's probably the group of people that you should be working with the most, because they have been through a lot of the struggles you've been through, and you can learn so much from them, and you can come join forces and make an even larger impact. So I
Yeah.
agree, let's start a podcasting club.
I think that's be fantastic. I did, I have to admit, I did try and start a network at one point. And if you go on Speak Up for Blue, it's a network.
That was
But
one of my questions. Was
yeah,
like, are you hosting other shows? Like, what's your goals for Speak Up for Blue Productions?
so the idea around the network was get a bunch of people together and let's start talking. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm failing at that because I'm so busy
Yeah.
just in my regular life. Because for those of you who don't know, I have a full-time job that's not in marine science or marine conservation. That doesn't include communication. It's like software, and I love the job. I love the people, but it takes up a lot of my time during the day. I got to pay the bills, right? And so when I do like my podcast, and I'm part of another podcast called Beyond Jaws, I do that at night, and I have a limited amount of time to do it. And so I overexerted myself to put all that together. It's, we have certain podcasts that we lost a bunch because of that loss of communication. That was on me. But I would love to get that going and just be like, I think when you put a network together with in podcasting with other networks, there's this thought of like monetization and like who's in charge of that, who's in charge of the marketing, like, so there's somebody who needs to like lead that. My initial thought on the network was, no, let's just put a bunch of podcasts together and we'll have it on one network. But the idea was more to collaborate and exchange ideas. So not even collaboration, just exchange ideas of like, how can we make each of our own podcasts better and others better? You know what I mean? And unfortunately, I just haven't been able to hop on that and be able to dedicate more time to it. But that's something that I would like to do in the future. And I've learned a lot, from those relationships that have either come and gone, and trying to be able to build on some and kind of do it in the future better, and be more collaborative. But I think it's something like, if somebody's going to do that, or if people are going to do that, you need to have a certain amount of time dedicated to just be like, this is what we can do in that time, and make it like full on, like democratic, everybody to, whether you're doing a meeting like once a quarter where somebody different runs the meeting, or, you all agree on the agenda. So it's productive and people get a lot out of it.
Yeah. I think we all also have like our huge list of ideas and programs and projects that we want to do. And it's like, just knowing that when is the timing right for you in your life based off of other things that are going on can be so hard, but we'll get to them. There's no shortage of time.
Absolutely.
As someone who recently rebranded our entire company, how did that go for you guys? I know you still have Speak Up for Blue as the parent production company, but you're now known as How to Protect the Ocean, your podcast show. And was that difficult for your listeners? I found that like, I thought it was going smooth on our end, but there are, it's difficult. It's hard.
100%. And I'm not that guy who I'm the guy who I'm just very much like you said, I have a lot of ideas always running through my head. And I'm the kind of guy or the kind of person who will throw it all against the wall and see which one sticks. So I'll try and do it all and see what it sticks. So I listened to a lot of podcasts on podcasting to get better at podcasting. I manage a number of like entrepreneurial podcasts, and then I do my own. So I'm always in that sphere trying to learn from podcasts, just short of like actually going to a podcast conference. But what I started to realize was at first it started off as Speak Up for Blue was the name of the podcast. And then I started to like look at like Apple Podcast is still my major listenership. And so I started to look at it. I started to like Google or like search in Apple, like in iTunes at the time, or Apple Connect or whatever, Apple Podcast, whatever it's called now. And so I started to like search for like ocean and what came up. And I'm like, why isn't my podcast coming up? This is ridiculous. Yeah. It's not. Where is it? Like, how is it? I'm like, I've got one of the only podcasts on oceans. Where is it? And I realized I'm like, there's no ocean in my name. It's Speak Up for Blue, because when I hear blue, I hear ocean. Yeah. But not everybody else does. And I was like, okay, so now I need to change that. And Google was starting to get into the game. They just released Google Podcasts at the time. And so they were starting to say, well, now your podcast is going to be searchable. Whereas it was supposed to be and it did for a little bit. I don't know if it still does, but if you search up your podcast, an audio clip would come up for your podcast. Oh. It doesn't happen as much before, but it did happen for a little bit. So I'm like, I want to be searchable. Now it's Google, SEO, we got to do this. So I'm like, I'll put, okay, Speak Up for the Ocean Blue. So then I started to put that in. I started to put ocean. I'm like, okay, now I'm starting to come about. And then I've been listening to over the past year or so, I started listening to people start talking about like, does your podcast, I joined a podcast coaching program. And they're like, what is your podcast about? I don't know what it's about. I'm like, well, Speak Up for the Ocean. So people are speaking up for the ocean. He's like, he didn't get it. The people that I was in the group chat with, they just didn't get it. And I was like, this is interesting. It got me super frustrated. And I took it personally at the beginning. Cause I was like, wait a minute, it's a cool name. But then I was like, and they're like, what do you talk about in your podcast? Well, I'm like, I'm trying to make people aware of the ocean and how to protect it. And I went, how to protect it. That's the name. Yeah. Like how much better can you get than how to protect the ocean? It just tells you in the name what we're trying to do in this podcast.
And young people, I mean, they're searching how to protect the ocean. Yeah. That's like the search that they're typing in. And so it's, I'm sure you're reaching such a wider audience now. And SEO is something that as entrepreneurs, we all have to learn. And sometimes we learn the hard way.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, and it's a good learning lesson, right? It's just, I'm a scientist. Like that's my background.
I know. We're doing our best. Like,
we're not taught to market because we're not taught communications in school that much. You may get a professor here and there that's really about it, but maybe more now, but it's really hard to, especially like when you can speak to other scientists and you're at conferences, you're preaching to the choir. They know the ocean's in trouble. They're just interested on how you did your specific topic and how you did your study, and they want to know more and how to collaborate and all that kind of stuff. But when you're talking to the public, when you're talking to your target audience, they're not necessarily understanding what you're trying to say. The jargon is different. The way you communicate is different. You can't be as direct. You kind of have to be like, hey, so this is what we discovered. It's kind of weird. This is going to be sometimes like, this is going to be a sensitive subject, just to warn you, like you may not like this, or this is going to be really negative, this one, but I'm going to try and put a positive spin on it. They don't want to hear negative. Going back to when I was doing the videos, I joined a CrossFit gym, and it was my first time doing CrossFit, and I still do it to this day. I love it. I'm not good at it, but I love it. But when I was doing videos at the time, and I remember we went out to dinner as a CrossFit gym, because that's what you do in a CrossFit. You spend a lot of time together. And I was at the dinner, and the owner of the gym was like, yeah, I was looking at your videos. They were good, but I had to stop. I was depressed after a while. Oh. And I was like, interesting. I expected somebody to be like, hear that stuff and then say, no, I need to change. Whereas somebody's like, no, I hear that stuff and it's so negative and I feel so hopeless that I'm just going to turn it off and I'm just going to ignore it. Yes. And that got to me. And so I was like, I need to start talking about more positive things. And I need to start talking about the interesting parts of the projects, where these projects can go. Like if I talk about a study, if I interview somebody about a study, where are they going? How are they going to get better? And that's what I look for now, is like, how do we inspire people? Like just like the documentaries, David Attenborough's inspirational, right? He's a legend, but because he's inspirational. When you watch those videos, when you see the hard things, you hear it in his voice. the hard things. Like you hear him almost crying when he's, like there's one, I think it was called Our Planet, and it was a bunch of walruses falling off cliffs and like dying, like in
Oh my gosh.
Alaska, right? It
Yes.
was like one of the worst things to watch, but you could hear it in his voice where he feels the pain too. And so you empathize with him, but then like he talks about what we need to do, and then you start to get, okay, now like it's starting to get hopeful. And I think that I learned a lot from that incident and that event where it's like, or that interaction was like, I need to be a little bit more hopeful, to give
Yeah.
people a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of hope, to say, let's be more optimistic about this. We can get through this. We just need to do more.
Yeah, and I think that I resonate completely because I was the same. Whereas I learned about the issues and the threats and the challenges, I just wanted, that was the motivator for me when I was
Mm-hmm.
in school. But that's not the motivator for everybody, and so it's
No.
about tapping into that motivation um, through positivity, especially the younger you go. Like we grew up in experiences with climate denial.
Yeah.
Now, a
Yeah.
lot of these young people are actually, they just have never denied it and are just terrified. And so,
Yeah.
how can we make sure that they want to be a marine biologist? Because I think going a few steps back, I wanted to study the ocean until I realized everything that it needed help
Mm.
with. And then it turned into conservation. And so, how can
Mm-hmm.
we communicate that marine biology and research and academia might, as you learn more about it, turn into conservation, activism, environmentalism, sustainability? It might just bring you down that path, which is a
Yeah.
hard path to walk. And how do you
Yeah.
sustain yourself in that journey? And it's finding community, it's
Yeah.
mentorship, it's
Yeah.
peers, it's all of the things that I hope that we provide with our shows.
Yeah. Well, that's the idea. And I always tell people, my audience, that you do not have to be a scientist
No.
to be involved with the ocean, to protect the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people think that, oh, I'm not a marine biologist. That's fine. We have a lot of marine biologists. You could argue at times we have too many marine biologists, right? A lot of us that
Yeah.
have become marine biologists have switched because either there's not enough funding, or it's really difficult to find a job, or, we need to go into different routes, or we find, new passions. But I always tell people, I'm like, if you got a business background or an entrepreneurial background,
Mm-hmm.
please,
Marketing. Yeah.
marketing, like, please get involved. Not just with like a nonprofit organization, start your own thing. There are a lot of people who are starting great businesses that are providing alternatives to, damage we're doing by eating, like, sort of overfished seafood and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. There are people who are making you more aware of the sustainable options if you choose to eat seafood, and where it's not as difficult to make those decisions, like in a grocery store or at a fish market, where we know that, was it 48% could be fraudulent of some seafood. And
Mm-hmm.
so there are so many people who are working their butts off. And I always tell people, I'm like, they're like, how do I know a company is actually truly sustainable? Because there's a lot of greenwashing out there. Let's be honest. Starbucks used to say that they were going to change their whole mission to be all sustainable. And then when they said, oh yeah, well, you guys don't like straws? Okay, we'll get rid of the straw, but we'll replace it with this plastic cap that's definitely not recyclable.
Yes.
And now you look at everything they have is like completely like, it's
Yeah.
literally garbage. It's not
Yeah.
even, it's not even going to help. But enough about Starbucks. I don't want to get people mad about them drinking their Starbucks, but like, it's really hard to find companies. And I always say, in the US and Canada as well, and I don't know if they're worldwide yet, there's a certification organization called B Corp. And it's literally bcorp.com, all one word, B as in Bob. And you can go on, they list all the people. So the companies pay to be audited by this organization. And what you can do is you can look up a company, say you want apparel, look up the company, and then it'll give a score based on, I think it's environment, social, which is like how they treat their employees, and sort of like everybody in the supply chain, and then like
Governance.
economical. Yeah,
Yeah.
governance. Yeah, governance. Yeah. So it's like three things, and you can look at their score and you can be like, oh, okay. And they have to be transparent. They have to say this is what they're trying to achieve. And you go on their website and they're proudly displaying like the B Corp symbol. And even though they may not be perfectly sustainable, they're working towards it. And they've gotten like a certain, I think it's a score, and you can get that score and you can tell. So you can feel better about your choices
Mm-hmm.
of whether it's apparel or towels or, cutlery or anything. And you feel better about yourself when you buy from that, because you're like, I know this company is good. And usually they're smaller companies. Some of them are bigger, but usually they're smaller startups and things like that. And I always tell people, I'm like, if you need to know where to go, I would start there, because you know exactly what you're getting.
It's simpler too for the consumer, but also the B Corp symbol is so trusted now and recognizable and visual that it's an entire branded community.
Yeah.
So that kind of bleeds a little bit into the last topic that I wanted to talk about, which is me and you obviously care so much about protecting the ocean and ocean conservation. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I just wanted to know, as far as management and research and all of the ways that we can protect the ocean. I know you have a background and are still active in marine protected area design. What is ocean conservation, perfect idealistic ocean conservation, look like to you? Which is a pretty large question, and we can revisit it later.
It's a great question, because we don't talk about that enough. Conservation has evolved. Marine conservation has evolved and continues to evolve as we learn more. When I first started, and even before that, we had a lot of parachute science. Where scientists and conservationists would go into an area, would do research, do all their research, take that research, and then bounce. Not communicating with the like local villages or local towns or whoever they were in the area with, not sharing their data, not providing them advice on how to apply what they've just learned. And so there was a lot of disconnect, and a lot of people, local people, what turns out, they didn't like that. Why would they? Why would you come in here, use all our resources, and then not give us anything back? We're helping you. A lot of times they were helping, and they want to know. A lot of people want to know. If you're coming in with extra information, they want to know. And plus, they also have a lot of information. A lot of these local people have a lot of information. They just don't have a big platform to put out their voice. And so for me, and today, and probably for the past like 30 years, what it should have looked like and what it should look like are people on the ground in the places where conservation needs to happen, have a voice, have an ability to take part, and are not vilified in the areas. They're not excluded from the areas, because if they're excluded, it's not going to work. Right. And there's been a lot of talk about large marine protected areas being placed in certain areas, but those areas, the people of those areas don't benefit, from it. And that's really sad. And that's a really sad product of understanding the sort of the negative aspects of doing that type of conservation. But the great part is we have a lot of technology. We have a lot of people who are doing great work in bringing those voices up and bringing them to the forefront. And if they're not involved in conferences, which they should be, like the bigger conferences, they make their own, and it's really great. Actually, just a couple of days ago, there was a great conference it's on YouTube, and it was called Upwell. And it was basically bringing those voices together, the voices of people who are on the ground, who are in areas that don't normally get a voice. A lot of indigenous peoples to the areas, marginalized groups, talking about ocean justice, talking about what the ocean means to them, and talking to each other, and sharing their stories, and trying to sort of bring that together. Now, what will happen from that, I don't know. I'm hoping to get them back. I had them on to promote the conference. I'm hoping to get the people who are in charge back on to say, hey, this is what we learned from there, and this is where the next step is. And hopefully this conference will continue to happen, whether it's yearly or by every 2 years, or even more than once a year, will happen. And so conservation to me is everybody's involved that needs to be involved. And so there's a bottom up and top down sort of approach, and it's equitable, and there's justice, and we'll get better results.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I
think it'll last so much longer if the communities that will be directly affected, the stakeholders, have buy-in and a say, and truly they have so much of the knowledge that is required to make it effective. Absolutely. And to add on to that, it's not always about the science. No. Science tells us one aspect of conservation. Conservation is managing
and having people manage the people that use the resources. The ocean in itself and the planet will be fine if we're not here. It'll go through its ups and downs, but it'll be fine. It has been fine for billions of years. We come here and we affect it, but then not everybody gets a voice to kind of fix it. And I think we need to do that. And so we need to include the human dimension as a major factor in conservation. And that's happening more and more. And that kind of comes to like what you and I are doing and what other people are doing with science communication, is telling those stories and just making sure those stories get on the same platforms so that more and more people can have that understanding. Because a lot of people I tell, about certain stories and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, why don't we just do that? But it hasn't been done for decades, or even hundreds of years. And so it's people like, why? That doesn't make sense. I'm like, yeah, you get it. And so I think we need to get more people on board that are not involved in conservation, because then you start to vote for people who want more conservation, because now more conservation is on people's minds. And so, it's conservation is just this huge thing that everybody needs to be involved in, and all different disciplines need to come together equally, not one more than the other. And everybody needs, like, we still need to make science-based decisions, but we need to include, social aspects, economic aspects, everything needs to be involved. Your voices, communication, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's going
You
to be
bet.
really valuable and resonate with folks. And then the last question that we always conclude with, which may or may not be an iteration of the message you just shared, is also kind of a big one, but it's just that if you could put a message on a billboard that all of the most powerful, important decision makers of regarding our ocean would see and hear and have to view and hear your message, what would that say?
That's a good question. That's a great question, actually. I would make it simple. I would just be like, live for a better ocean. That's been my motto. Every time I think about my daily habits, is this good for the ocean? And it's made me second guess a lot of things. Even like think about like convenience stores. They're called convenience stores because they're convenient. When you need something, you can go there. If you're thirsty, you can go get some water. But do you really need it? Like, do you really need that bottle, that plastic bottle that's going to get thrown out or into the recycling for like maybe 2 cycles at most? Do you really need that? Do you really need, that chocolate bar where that waste is just going to go? Like, start to think more about how is this going to affect the waterways, the oceans. They're all connected. The planet, it's all connected. How is this going to affect it? If I want to go on a trip, how can I make it the best in terms of eco-friendly and sustainable? So if you start thinking in that kind of way, then it starts to get to the bigger picture. If I vote, is the person I vote for thinking about sustainability like I am? They're a representation of my area and me. So is that, like, it doesn't matter the party. I don't care about parties. That individual, are they going to fight for what's important to me? What's important to me is to live for a better ocean and a better planet. So how are they going to do that? And you put them to the test. Then you start talking to them and start interacting. Because once you start thinking about that, you start talking about it more, people start to understand. And then even going, like, I go to my MP, I have a good relationship with my member of parliament here in Canada. And I talk to them. I'm like, look, man, like, that decision that you guys made, I wasn't happy with it. I'll be honest. And they're like, I get it. Like, I know. And then, like, what would you like to see? And I'm like, this is what I would like to see.
Yeah.
And you start to have that like, they are regular people. They might be richer than you. They might be better off than you, but they are there to represent you. And when you start to think about living for a better ocean in your own life, you start to think about how are other people living for better, and how can we start to make the decisions in the policy. That's where we hit the big time. Right.
And I love what you said about they are just people, because as I built a relationship with my own representatives here, I've realized, like, they can't read our minds. We have to tell them what we want. And to be honest, they've got a million things on their plate, just like every other human in the world. And so we need to be like, here are some of the pieces of legislation that align with my values that we would love for you to support. Like, just make it easier for them, because it's not always as personal as maybe we think it is.
I have a great story I know we're at the end of this
no,
episode.
that's okay. Tell us.
So I was talking to at that IMCC meeting. I was talking to somebody. I got an interview out of him. It's I believe it was Dr. Moore, and he runs. I believe it's the River Project. It's been a while since I've talked to him. Actually, I should talk to him again. But he was telling me, I'm like, what do you do? Like he has this organization. It's not a big organization. It's his own nonprofit. I said, how do you like you're involved in all this like stuff in the government level? Like how do you get involved? And he's like, I've built relationships over. He was older. I built relationships over my years. He's like, I've built relationships with politicians. When there's a new politician, I build relationships with them. I get to know them. I don't judge them for what party they're a part of. I just get to know them, right? Unless they're real. There's some people in government that you don't want to have a relationship with, but most of them are just, like you said, they're just regular people. They have their own likes. They have their own dislikes. You have to know what their interests are. You have to know who they are to do something. So what he would do, and I remember him talking about, it was the Marine Sanctuary, the Seamounts one on the East Coast in Massachusetts, I think, or New England area. And it was when that went right before that went into play. He has this big email list, and he put out an email list and was like, if I'm going down to Congress and the Senate, and I am going to talk to some politicians about putting the sanctuary in. I need your stories. Why is this important for this sanctuary to go in to you? Tell me your stories. How do you use it? What do you think about it? All that kind of stuff. And he said he compiled all these stories, emails, messages, letters, printed them all off. And he had like a huge stack of them. And then he went down to Washington, D.C. and he would make appointments with his Congress members, Senates and stuff like that. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. He walked in and he'd just be like, how are you? How's it going? It's been a while since we've seen it. How are the kids? How are this? Oh, by the way, I have this stack of stories of people who want the sanctuary to go in. I'm going to give it to you, and then you do what you need to do with it. And he said sometimes, they would be honest. They'd be like, look, my party's going to vote this way. There's nothing I can do, but I'll give it to them. It's great. And then he would sit back and he would just be like, what are the kids? How is little Jimmy's soccer? How was little Sally's, dance recital or football, game? And they would chat for like half an hour. And he's like, thank you very much. And he'll walk away, and then he'll go down and do the same thing with the next one. And by having that relationship, he goes, there are Republicans who are very environmental. There are Republicans who will vote for the environment if they can. It all depends on what the party's doing. And I know it's a little bit different now, but it's build that relationship. And show them who you are and what your values are. And if you're respectful and you're still standing your ground, but you're respectful and you do it in a way where they can understand, they can listen to you, and you do it properly and you learn as you go along, you'll probably get more stuff done than going like super aggressive, only protest in public and not talk to them and that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? And so I feel like there's a lot of value in that. And I've taken a lot from that and started to talk to my own member of parliament here, my own representative at all the different levels.
Yeah.
You
have to humanize it, right? You have you just have to humanize it. Humanize conservation, humanize really the political process, which can be grueling and overwhelming, but that's how the work gets done. And that's also what I'm realizing is that it's a investment of a lifetime to be able to have those relationships and just kind of have them take your meeting. If you put the request in, they're going to take that meeting if they know you, and they only know you by you putting in the work to get to know them.
Yes. That saying is not what you know, but who you know.
Yeah.
And if you treat people well and you're respectful and you still stand your ground, but you treat people well, there's the ability to agree to disagree on certain aspects. Yeah. I'm talking about environment. I'm not talking about human rights or certain things that have been coming up, politically in the world that we see today. But, when you're talking about you can agree to disagree, but you can still get your word across and you can still get them thinking about it in the back of their mind. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Andrew.
I thank you for having me. I had so much fun.
We're going to have to do it again. I feel like we didn't even scrape the surface.
We'll have to have you on my podcast.
Yes,
we're going to have to do the whole interview. So we'll do. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much.